Hey, Uncle Mark.
Yes, sir.
I know that you recently crossed a border that is somewhat impenetrable right now because we're still in the middle of a pandemic.
I managed to slide through into a closed country across the largest undefended border in the world, which is quite something.
You just got to lube up a lot.
Yeah, you gotta make a run for it.
Anyway, the one of the things that you did before you went there was to get yourself a shot in the arm.
I sure did, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah, and I've got my appointment. I finally got an appointment because I finally in Utah I'm in an age group that's going to get them. So in a week and a half I'm going to be getting my first shot.
That's good. So they finally lowered it to uncles.
Yeah, exactly. It's now exactly. Not like Uncle Mark old people style, but like us young and spry uncles can get them too now here.
You teenagers.
In Utah.
That's right.
But the question is, do I really want it?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there.
No.
It just seems like preventing this disease is not a good idea for some reason. And I'm not sure why, but I'm pretty sure that, Uncle Doug, you can tell me.
Well, I'm going to do my best to convince you otherwise.
Okay.
Like Uncle Dan just referenced, Uncle Mark and I have both been vaccinated. I'm so happy to hear about that, Dan. I didn't know that you're getting your vaccine in short order.
Yeah.
That's great news. And once the government has managed to get all podcasters vaccinated, they can move on to doctors, nurses, teachers, and the general public. So
all
hang
the
in
non-essential workers.
That's right.
Right.
So hopefully many of you out there have either received your first vaccination or are getting close to being able to.
Something tells me Joe Rogan's not going to be getting one, but that's a subject for another day.
Because the needle would break trying to penetrate his thick fucking skin. It's crazy that it's basically been 1 year since this all started, depending on obviously where you are. And so it's hard not to take stock of what we've all been through in these last 12 interminable months. But as the experts keep telling us, we are not through this yet. And whether we actually get out of this depends on the vast majority of us doing the right things. We still need to wash our hands, practice proper social distancing, stay away from parties, sporting events, and concerts, wear masks diligently, and get the fucking vaccine as soon as we all can. There is still a real possibility that this virus could mutate into something that makes all this sacrifice and effort for nothing. So the subject of my segment today could not be more timely. Today, I want to talk about anti-vaxxers and the anti-vax movement.
Yeah.
Look, on this show, we have talked about every form and fashion of woo out there, and anti-vax is definitely a woo, but most woos are basically harmless. If you want to get your palm read, go for it. If you don't want to leave the house until you've read your daily horoscope, who cares? If you want to try and communicate with your dead relatives via a Ouija board, I'll light the candles for you. If you want to stick a jade egg up your recently steamed vagine, cram the fucker up there. Just don't do it during allergy season. So,
Jade is hypoallergenic, isn't it?
of course, these woos can be harmful if, say, by following some fortune cookie prediction, you make bad decisions. And there are woos that are inherently harmful, like trepidation, or trepanation, or grimace conjuring.
Yeah, being reluctant is not a woo.
Yeah, exactly. But there is only one woo that is on the World Health Organization's top 10 list of global health threats, and that's anti-vax, or as they put it, vaccine hesitancy. Want to know what else is on that list? Well, COVID-19, obviously, poor third world healthcare, Ebola, dengue fever, HIV, and climate change. That's right.
Guy Fieri.
Guy Fieri. That's right. The World Health Organization sees anti-vax as dangerous as AIDS and climate change.
Jesus.
There is no real way to know how many people die every year due to anti-vax and the damage it causes. But the WHO believes that at least 1.5 million people a year could be saved if vaccine distribution was marginally improved. And one of the biggest impediments to that marginal improvement is the anti-vax movement. So, yeah. The numbers get big real fast. As we'll discuss, the anti-vax movement could actually derail our efforts to defeat COVID-19, plunging us back into the pit where we were all a year ago, and killing millions more people.
Yeah.
Unlike the viruses of the body this movement seeks to protect, anti-vax is a virus of the mind, and as such, might be one of the deadliest viruses in history. Underlying all of this is the fact that anti-vax is stupid, belligerent, anti-science, often racist, and easily disprovable. Not only that, but it's also inconsistently applied, illogical to its core, and poorly thought out if any of its adherents actually think about it at all.
Oh, they think. They think hard. They have developed many, many vociferous ways of defending their position. So,
well, if you say so. But we'll
I'm not saying good or smart ways, just many, many ways.
Well, let's agree on loud.
Okay.
Unlike other woos, this one has to be confronted and defeated, or we're doomed. I would never tell you to slap the tarot cards out of the hands of the yoga instructor you're trying to have sex with, but if you know any anti-vaxxers, you should really talk to them and try and change their mind.
Yeah.
If this virus of the mind is not confronted and treated, it could kill us all. So, let's dig in, shall we? As early as the 10th century in China, someone noticed that those who had previously had a mild case of a deadly disease were less susceptible to that disease later. This led to a practice called variolation, wherein pus or scabs from an infected person are blown up the nasal passages or rubbed on scratches on the skin of an uninfected individual. I know
Which
this
is
sounds
just as sexy as it sounds.
I know this sounds disgusting, but honestly, it was probably the least disgusting thing to have happen to you on any given day in the 10th century. Why this practice worked and would remain a mystery for centuries, but by the 16th and 17th century, it was in fairly wide use in China, India, and Turkey before making its way to England in the 18th century. Now, here's the thing. 18th century England was certainly somewhat enlightened, a somewhat enlightened place for the world back then, but that doesn't mean it wasn't still barbaric.
Yeah.
So some of the first true scientific experiments of vaccines were carried out on children, prisoners, and slaves. None of whom
Well,
were
who
in,
else are you going to do it on? Perfectly good, like grown-up white people?
consenting
children?
Yeah. This would
They're
unfortunately
pretty disposable back then, the children.
Wow,
Truly.
this is a bad show for kids, man.
yeah, right, no doubt.
Yeah.
This would unfortunately be a part of the development and experimentation of vaccines for well over 100 years, and as we'll see, these evil practices would become a small bit of the fodder that would become the anti-vaxxer movement. But before we get to that, let's talk about what a game-changing development vaccine science was for the human race. Prior to their development, when a disease crossed over from some animal to humanity, all we could really do was just wait for it to run its course. Outbreaks of cholera, influenza, and of course bubonic.
That's known as the Trump plan.
That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, outbreaks of cholera, influenza, and of course bubonic plague would kill millions of people per outbreak. The version of the bubonic plague known as the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people between 1346 and 1353.
Jesus.
Yeah, bad
Yeah, but they
stuff.
were just weak.
HIV/AIDS is still a global pandemic and has killed more than 36 million people since 1981. Of course, there is not a vaccine yet for this disease, but the therapeutics are incredible, if expensive, and HIV/AIDS is very preventable. The reasons that it has and continues to spread, basically racism and religious stupidity, are very much a part of the anti-vax movement, as we'll discuss. But yeah, I mean, that you know, we were all alive during the AIDS crisis in the 80s, although, you know, pretty young and pretty dumb. But that was a terribly preventable disease that was treated as a gay disease, a black disease, an African disease, and was able to spread. So that's good stuff.
Yeah. And when people died of it, it was horrid. It was absolutely horrible.
Terrible.
So the fact that these therapeutics now exist and guys that caught it in the original wave are dying of old age is incredible.
It's incredible, and it bears mentioning, we'll get back to this.
Yeah.
That's not happening everywhere that AIDS is a problem. But
Of course it's not.
Right,
Of course
exactly.
it's not.
So in the 1880s, Louis Pasteur brought what was a pretty chaotic and unorganized field of science into the modern age when he developed microbial fermentation and pasteurization. Since then, we have developed vaccines for puerperal fever, rabies, anthrax, cholera, polio, measles, tetanus, smallpox, chickenpox, influenza, HPV, hepatitis, Lyme disease, rubella, whooping cough, rotavirus, mumps, diphtheria, dengue, malaria, tuberculosis, among others. So it's been a game-changing development for the human species.
Yeah.
This, of course, brings us to today and the emergence of COVID-19. As we have all become acutely aware, this disease is incredibly contagious, having spread from Wuhan, China to every corner of the globe in a matter of months. As of the time of this record, COVID-19 has killed 2.69 million people worldwide, with the U.S. accounting for 539,000 of those deaths. So we're number one.
Yeah.
And because of the incompetence of national governments, the selfishness of far too many, and the vast amounts of disinformation already in the psychological bloodstream from the anti-vax movement, this disease was poised to simply just wash around the globe over and over until new and more resistant and more deadly strains evolved. And let's not be too optimistic. This could still happen. We are in a desperate foot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we're happening now. Right?
We're in a desperate foot race against these variants as we speak. The only way we can beat this virus back and stop the carnage, let alone get back to some sort of normalcy, is for enough of us and our fellow humans all over the world, not just in our own countries, to get the vaccines that are now available to reach herd immunity. Now, we've all heard that term. It is, of course, the critical mass of humans that have to have immunity such that the disease cannot spread with impunity.
Excuse me, the former president called it herd mentality. So,
he did.
You're,
he did
you're
indeed.
wrong.
In the most apt Freudian slip in history. Once herd immunity is reached, the reproduction number reaches 0. This is called R0, right, or R0. Right now, COVID-19 is between R2 and R3, meaning that each person who gets it can infect 2 to 3 other people. In order to reach herd immunity, or R0, with COVID-19, between 50 and 67% of the population needs the vaccine. In America, this means 164 million to 224 million people need to be vaccinated.
But more would be better.
More, always better. This is the baseline just to stop the spread.
Right.
But remember, this is a global pandemic, and the longer this disease persists anywhere, the higher the chances that dangerous variants can evolve and defeat the vaccines. So to win this, 50 to 67% of the populations of England, China, Iraq, Togo, and Benin need to be vaccinated. Worldwide, that is 3.8 to 5.1 billion people need to get vaccinated, and fast. As of now, 77 or so million Americans have received at least their first dose of the vaccine, which is a good start. But globally, only 410 million people have been vaccinated so far. That's bad. That's only 8 to 11% of where we need to be. We are not through this yet, and there is no time to spare, and there is certainly not time for the disinformation campaign by the anti-vax movement and its erstwhile allies. The mere fact that we have these vaccines at all is truly incredible. And I've heard, including us, have referred to it as miraculous because that word by its very definition is meant to apply to events that defy explanation or expectations. But this was not a miracle. This was the achievement of generations of scientists and the body of work they have all contributed to. So let's talk about these vaccines for a second because it will inform where we end up. While the COVID-19 virus was new to humanity, hence the term novel, there was a robust body of knowledge of coronaviruses out there due to the previous coronaviruses like SARS and MERS.
Right.
This data was shared globally in an open source initiative called GISAID, or GISAID, which shares genomic data on influenza viruses with anybody that wants it. Because of that body of knowledge, we were not starting out from zero. But even still, not only had it taken years to develop vaccines in the past, there was not any vaccine in existence for any kind of coronavirus. So the challenge was extreme. As the pandemic enveloped the globe in early 2020, scientists were able to isolate COVID-19's genetic sequence on January 11th, 2020, which in itself is incredible. Next, there was...
that's really quick.
Super, super quick. Next, there was an unprecedented collaborative effort undertaken by national governments, drug companies, and research universities to find a vaccine. The main vehicles for this effort were the WHO and an initiative by the G20 called Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. So these are the two main bodies that kind of tried to coordinate all this research.
I think you mean President Trump's Warp Speed initiative.
Well,
I think that's what you're...
I'll get to that for sure.
Okay.
And yes, that's the WHO that said Donald Trump pulled us from in May of 2020 because he needed to blame someone for his failures, and this is true because they refused to call it the China virus, which is something that would have no evil consequences at all, right?
Yeah, that hasn't turned into anything even shittier.
Nope, not at all.
It's been great.
Yeah.
So Uncle Dan mentioned Warp Speed. In May, Trump announced Operation Warp Speed, which was an effort to fast-track funding, clinical trials, approval, and distribution of potential vaccines. It was named Operation Warp Speed because Donald Trump is a child.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it was not.
But also, do you think he ever watched Star Trek? Like, that doesn't.
I'm guessing that was a like Jared Kushner name
or Don Jr. or something.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. Like, he doesn't seem to. He couldn't watch something like that and glean anything from it. He's just too fucking self-absorbed.
Exactly. Yeah, the fact that it wasn't Operation Trump Speed is
Yeah.
pretty surprising. So the thing is, it's not a wholly bad idea to do this, but Trump ran it, unsurprisingly, like he's run everything else in his life.
Into the ground.
Basically. So although Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson did take funding from Warp Speed to develop their vaccines, Pfizer did not wanting to infect, pun intended, their research with the Trump administration's incompetence. As for the distribution phase of Warp Speed, Trump did basically nothing.
Right.
God only knows how this would have panned out had he won the election.
Point of order. He didn't do nothing. He took full credit for it.
That's exactly right.
That's true.
That's not nothing.
Well, and that's what's so funny. Not only, he's claiming credit to this day for the vaccines.
Well, I think Biden should give him some credit and respect because we all remember how much credit and respect Trump gave the previous administration
For the economy. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So Trump is claiming credit for this to this day, which sets up one of the many contradictions in this story. The foot soldiers in Trump's army are by and large QAnon-believing anti-vaxxers. And here we have Trump winking at them while demanding credit for the vaccines.
Yeah.
And very tepidly encouraging people to get vaccinated, but keeping his own vaccination secret. This will not be
but we know that the Q brain is incredible. Incoherency it's not a problem.
Truly. And I remain convinced that Trump didn't show a picture of him getting the vaccine because he didn't want to see him in a short-sleeve shirt with his shirt pulled up. I believe that.
Right.
Well, none of us wanted to see
That's
that.
fair.
So I thank him for it.
That's fair. So with all that context, let's get to the anti-vaxxers. Since the first vaccinations, there have been anti-vaxxers. There were those who objected to having scabs blown up their nostrils because it was gross, it was weird, and no one understood why it worked, or in many cases because religious leaders railed against it. These religious arguments ran the gambit from science is devil worship to viruses were created by God to punish the wicked, and any attempt to stop them was fighting against the will of God. All true.
Right. It's the same reason that when Ben Franklin put a lightning rod on wherever it was, Town Hall in Philadelphia or whatever, and all the churches invade against it as subverting God's will, and then 2 years later they all had lightning rods.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in the 19th century, there were anti-vaccination leagues that sprung up in the U.S. and the U.K. that slowed down the vaccination campaigns against smallpox and led to untold numbers of unnecessary deaths. Similar leagues appeared all around the world as that campaign continued. Most of these leagues focused on what would become the main fear of all anti-vaxxers, harm to children. Most current anti-vaxxers fall into two buckets, with one being far larger and more nefarious than the other. The biggest group...
Can we just keep them in the buckets?
Truly. If we could seal it, then that would be great. The biggest group are those that believe that there is some conspiracy or several conspiracies behind vaccines. And we'll get to that.
Right.
These range from the profit motive of the pharmaceutical and medical industry all the way to alien experimentation.
Of course.
Whatever their particular belief is, it's based on a belief in dark forces with no regard for public health. The second, much smaller bucket are those that simply don't care enough to get vaccinated. They don't think they're the problem, so they don't feel any need to be part of the solution. So, while the latter is certainly a cause for concern, it's the former group that is a global crisis. And there are different kinds of anti-vaxxers. There's some who completely deny and eschew any kind of vaccination. There are some that want to, spread out vaccinations over time or only get this one or that one. So they kind of run the gambit, but they pretty much all believe the same things. They're all looking at the same materials, And so we're going to keep them in a single group for the purpose of this discussion. Because whatever you're doing, if you're slowing down vaccines or you're not getting them, the effect is the same.
Right.
Yeah. The modern iteration of this insanity has its roots in the campaign to vaccinate against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. I hope I said that right.
Pertussis, I think.
In the 1970s, conflicting and spurious reports appeared in the UK press that there was significant neurological after effects from this vaccine in children. Not true, but in the hysteria that followed, a film called Vaccination Roulette and a book called A Shot in the Dark hit the market. These two works describe dark conspiracies.
When was this, Doug?
This was in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s.
Oh, the 70s. Okay.
Yeah. So this, what we call the anti-vax movement isn't that old.
That's
like
older than I thought, actually.
Well, it didn't get its real. We'll get to really where it kind of got its injection, so to speak.
Right.
But both these films were the film and this book were complete hooey, but they're still around today. They're still in circulation. Then came the inciting incident of the modern anti-vax movement. In 1998, a British physician named Andrew Wakefield released a paper in The Lancet called Iliad Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. Try saying that 3 times.
Yeah.
Or just once. The paper claimed a link between vaccinations for measles, mumps, and rubella and autism in children.
Right.
Given that Wakefield was a doctor at the time, he's not anymore.
Right.
And the paper sounded scientific. It caused a major stir, one that we are still feeling today. I don't want to spend too much time on Wakefield because he is truly one of the world's greatest monsters and quite literally may have as much blood on his hands as any of history's greatest villains.
Yeah, he's essentially a baby murderer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except to say that it turns out that he was paid by various anti-vax organizations to produce the paper, and the paper itself was so completely spurious that Lancet retracted it and Wakefield was stripped of his medical license.
Wow.
That hasn't stopped him, though. He was behind the quote-unquote documentary Vaxxed that came out in the 2000s with the tagline, "The movie they don't want you to see."
Gotta love that. That's all conspiracy theorists. That's catnip right there.
Exactly. And it's basically the Citizen Kane of the anti-vax movement. Go ahead and watch the trailer for this monstrous nightmare if you're up to it. And if you're not filled with boiling hate for Wakefield, I don't want to know you. It's nefarious, it's manipulative, it's grotesque, it's shocking.
Yeah, the God-Awful Movies guys did it, right?
Yeah.
And I think they pounded it like a nail.
It's horrible. And, not for nothing, but because, autism is tragic and it's very difficult for families of autistic people to raise autistic children. And again, I'm not trying to shame or if anyone out there is offended by that, I don't mean that by any stretch.
Yeah, I would ask to modify tragic. I think it's just simply a different way of being that can be more challenging.
Yeah, of course. But to try and manipulate people with autistic children, autistic family members, and then use that video to manipulate others, I think is tragic. I think it's fucked up.
And completely missing from the conversation is the fact that autism is way better than most of the diseases which vaccines prevent.
Google a fucking picture of smallpox.
So in the research
or polio.
In the research for this, I saw a lot of what's so fucked up is I saw a lot of photos about this stuff from recent, like not pictures of people with smallpox in 1890.
Smallpox, has it reoccurred?
Smallpox hasn't, but polio has had some outbreaks, stuff like that, because of this fucking shit. So the sequel to this piece of shit Vaxxed movie, Vaxxed 2, The People's Truth,
Electric Boogaloo,
was released in November of 2019, mere months before the COVID pandemic. And I don't want to wish ill on people, so I'm going to stop talking about Wakefield right now. But this fear that these vaccines caused autism was based on the fact, pounded in these documentaries, that these vaccines contained trace amounts of mercury in the form of a chemical called thimerosal, which contains 49% methyl mercury. However, so little thimerosal was used in these vaccines that it came nowhere near a dose that could potentially cause harm. And in fact, in 2003, the Danish researchers conducted a study involving thousands of children who received vaccines containing thimerosal and thousands who received vaccines that contained none, and they found that the instances of autism was exactly the same in both groups. These vaccines, thimerosal, methylmercury, are not causing autism. But thimerosal has been removed from almost every major vaccine simply due to the public perception.
Yeah.
So, this fear of the unfortunate truth, though, is this fear of vaccines and medical science being less than forthright and ethical is not entirely without cause. I mentioned earlier that the first vaccination experiments were carried out on slaves, children, and prisoners. Not good. Then, of course,
I don't want slaves and prisoners to get it, but I'm just wondering why the children are thrown in there.
I think because
they're
well,
just
you know
useless?
why? No, I think it's because a lot of these diseases struck children.
Childhood. Okay.
So they're like, oh, we'll just use children to experiment with. Right. Then, of course, there were the Tuskegee Experiments, carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service, Tuskegee University, and the CDC, in which African American men were told they were being given free health care to treat their syphilis, when in reality they were not. And for 40 years, they were observed to see what long-term syphilis would do to the human body.
Jesus.
Yeah, this led to the painful and miserable death of 128 of the men. It is one of the darkest chapters in American medical history and has been a consistent reason for mistrust of the U.S. government, particularly by African Americans ever since, for good reason.
Yeah. There are some people that I think are justified in their hesitancy.
Yep.
But it's not fucking Jenny McCarthy and, her fucking social set of white upper-class liberals in Hollywood. That's bullshit. Right. Yeah.
And we'll definitely we'll dig into that and hate on some people here in a minute.
Yeah.
But the Tuskegee experiments did lead to some major reforms in the U.S. health industry that remain today, including the creation of the Office for Human Research Protections within the Health and Human Services Administration. So these exist specifically to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. The body of law that exists because of Tuskegee is significant. But if your natural inclination is to mistrust the government, well, the Tuskegee experiments certainly don't help.
Yeah.
Another tenet of the anti-vax movement is something called vaccine overload. This is not a medical term, by the way, but essentially means that too much vaccine or vaccines administered in too rapid a succession will weaken the immune system and lead to adverse effects. Again, this is hogwash. So this is a really interesting fact. Not only have vaccines become so efficacious over the last several decades, such that the immunological components in the 14 vaccines administered to children today is less than 10% of what it was in the 7 vaccines administered in 1980.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's the vaccine science has come a long way. And, not for nothing, but many vaccines must be administered on a specific timeline in order to work. Yet vaccine overload, unfortunately, is still a common cry amongst anti-vaxxers. Ironically, the success of many vaccines is one of the main driving forces behind the anti-vax movement.
I'm sorry, Trump actually brought that up at one of the debates before he was president.
Yeah.
Just saying, why don't we just space it out more?
Exactly.
Huh?
Yep. The success of many vaccines is ironically working against them. Quote, nobody has measles or polio anymore, so why do they keep injecting us with it? Is like a common trope of anti-vaxxers. So while the answer to this seems so obvious as to be mind-blowing, it's very common. Because of this, ironically, anti-vax sentiment has caused outbreaks of cholera, whooping cough, measles, mumps, and tuberculosis in the United States in the last several years.
All of which were basically eliminated.
Yep, exactly. I mentioned before that there is inherent racism to the anti-vax movement, because there is. Firstly, the anti-vax movement is heavily involved in all things conspiratorial, including QAnon, which are inherently racist. Nobody wants to be called a racist, especially racists. Most anti-vaxxers don't even want to be called that, preferring the moniker vaccine risk aware. And, anti-vax is by no means only a white phenomenon. However, the communities often hit first and hit hardest by disease outbreaks are black and brown communities. One of the best ways to combat and curb the spread of viral diseases is to get them where they start, which is oftentimes poorer countries. So back in 2014, we went to West Africa, the U.S. went to West Africa to help prevent the spread of Ebola and successfully managed to keep this terrible disease from spreading out of control. Guess what? Anti-vaxxers are often against funding for efforts in these poor, often black and brown countries. We're seeing this in real time now with COVID-19. The reasons that black and brown communities are medically disadvantaged are many and systemic, but they are undeniable.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, if your unsubstantiated, ridiculous, and easily disprovable beliefs lead to bad outcomes in primarily black and brown communities, I don't know what else to call that but racist. Anti-vax just stinks of white privilege, front to back.
Yes, it does for sure.
Yet, and unfortunately, this movement has garnered some famous, and powerful adherents from minor celebrities like Jessica Biel, Jim Carrey, Jenny McCarthy, Alicia Silverstone, Jenna Elfman, Juliette Lewis, Charlie Sheen, rapist Danny Masterson, Selma Blair, and to a certain extent Bill Maher, all the way up to, God help me, Robert De Niro.
I know.
That one hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really? Why?
Well, I mean, I guess Bad Grandpa, I still want my money back for Bad Grandpa, but not
He's a good actor, but,
I never thought of him as an idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and not to mention, like you said, Uncle Mark, the 45th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Among many tweets and outbursts on the subject, he tweeted in 2014, quote, "Healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shot of many vaccines, doesn't feel good and changes. Autism. Many such cases."
God.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel good and changes.
Yeah.
It was a good tweet, though. We got to give him credit for that. That's a solid tweet right there.
So, yeah, the man in charge of Project Warp Speed, the government initiative to generate and distribute a vaccine from May of 2020 to January of 2021, was an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that vaccines are wildly safe and effective. There aren't many things that have such a consensus. If 4 out of 5 dentists recommend a toothbrush, you're going to go buy it. Yet that's nothing compared to the consensus on vaccines.
Right.
And not for nothing, we've harped on this before, the scientific method that led to vaccines is the same method that has led to air travel, smartphones, GPS, Viagra, the germ theory of disease, CRISPR, Jar Jar Binks, electricity, the internet, and grimace conjuring. You don't get to pick and choose here. You either believe in reputable science or you don't. And if you don't, that's fine, but please to be handing in your car keys and laptop.
Well, you can be skeptical about it, but once you examine the evidence,
right,
there's nothing to support the anti-vax position.
Exactly.
Well, except that they've got their own evidence, and
exactly,
and they've got a whole cadre of their own doctors and their own scientists who say the opposite things.
And go ahead, Doug.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and you may be going to mention this, but the Catholic Church, of course, just came out and said Catholics shouldn't get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because fetal tissue was part of the research.
I didn't even know that.
Yep.
I'm gonna go punch a hole in my television real quick.
Yeah.
So this brings us to our current crisis. Throughout the COVID pandemic, anti-vaxxers have been howling that this was a hoax or that it was a bioweapon that the Chinese either released on purpose or lost control of, and now that the vaccines are untested and dangerous. This was all spelled out in yet another quote-unquote documentary released in 2020 called Plandemic.
Oh, yeah.
This piece of propaganda pushed the conspiracy that COVID was man-made, that doctors and hospitals used the pandemic as a money-making venture, that masks actually cause disease, and that hydroxychloroquine is effective in stopping COVID. Absolutely none of this is true and is obviously counterproductive and dangerous, but if you know any anti-vaxxers, you can bet money they've seen it. So the filmmakers have been discredited. The whole thing is a piece of shit, but it's out there. And the final piece of the puzzle to talk about is the speed with which the COVID vaccines were developed rather than developed, because that's a big trope of anti-vaxxers is these came out too fast. Rather than seeing this as a towering achievement of medical science, anti-vaxxers point to it as proof that it's all rigged. Their point being that the government had them all along, or they weren't tested rigorously enough and we don't know what's in them.
Or both.
Or both.
They like to
or all the
they
things.
like to believe all the things.
Yeah, they can believe all the things at once.
Regardless of whether it makes any sense.
To the first point, I can only say that if Donald Trump had been hiding the vaccine this whole time and the early release would have guaranteed his victory, is there any person alive that thinks he would not have blurted it out at some point?
Totally.
Right.
To the second point, we do know what's in these vaccines. You can look it up online. The thing is, if you're not a medical or virological expert, or can speak English like me, you're probably not going to fully understand the what's in this stuff. But again, I don't fully understand how the internal combustion engine works, but I don't think it's a government conspiracy to get me to work on time.
Yeah,
well,
do you know what?
your car...
Do people know what's in a fucking pizza when they order it?
Well, that's exactly right. I find it hard to stomach the argument that we should refuse to put something in our body unless we fully understand what it's from, what's in it from the people who celebrate the return of the McRib, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, think about that the next time you cram Doritos in your mouth and wash it down with a vodka tonic. So, anyway, and they were rigorously tested. No steps were skipped. In a stroke of genius, many of the steps necessary to create and test a vaccine were run concurrently rather than in sequence. And some of the funding for this process came from, you guessed it, Operation Warp Speed. So through gritted teeth, if you must, you can tell your anti-vax friends that Trump deserves some credit here, although with 539,000 caveats.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little long in the tooth here, but I thought it was important to cover all this ground. So let's just sum up. Vaccines do not cause autism in children. There is no such thing as vaccine overload. We know exactly what's in the COVID vaccines. They were absolutely tested and are very safe, and you should not be taking your medical advice from Charlie Sheen. So
right, take it from us.
Right, exactly. Take it from your doctor. So I hate to do this, but if there are any anti-vaxxers in your life, it might be a worthwhile effort to engage with them and try, if you can, to convince them or enlighten them or move them, because this thing is bad. It's real bad.
And we need everybody on board.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it's not just a matter of, well, they're only risking their own lives, because they're not.
There's no peeing section in a public pool.
Is it so dangerous to them that they're willing to go through another fucking year of this?
Right?
You know?
Or 5 years? Because who knows? Like, if a variant pops up that's tricky or that's harder to make a vaccine for, we're all fucked. So thank God we've got a vaccine.
Yep.
Get it. Let's get the herd immunity so that we're okay.
Yeah. We need to do this together, and it's someone's going to have to talk to these people. I guess it's going to have to be us.
It's going to have to be us. If not us, if not now, when? If not who, us. That's how it is.
Right.
So. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Uncle Doug. I know that was a lot of work.
Yeah.
All right.
Woo! Let's move on.